Welcome to downtown Cleveland, and today we're going to take a look at what came before the mall, arcades. And no, I'm not talking about Space Invaders and coin pushers. Back in the day, arcades, as pictured here, were effectively proto-malls often found downtown. We'll be looking at two old-era arcades of the day, and, well, these are my kind of places. So let's get started with the Cleveland Arcade. Cleveland Arcade goes as far back as 1890, being built by a company known as the Detroit Bridge Company, and would be designed by John Eisenman and George H. Smith. The building would consist of two 9-story buildings joined together by the 5-story corridor, and the architecture of the arcade would draw heavy inspiration from the Italian landmark Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II, located in Milan. I don't know if I pronounced all that right, so bear with me. To put into perspective of what the Cleveland Arcade saw, here's a few things that happened in Cleveland's lifetime from the 1890s to now. And I didn't get everything, so there's even more that I'm not talking about. The Cleveland May Day riots of 1919, the Roaring Twenties that brought forward jazz, the Playhouse Square, and Prohibition, the Great Depression, a post-World War II economic boom, as well as major sports victories by the Barons hockey team and the Cleveland Browns before they began the world's longest rebuilding season, the rise and fall of the steel industry, the civil rights movement, drastic decline over the 70s and 80s, and finally, economic recovery over the first quarter of the 21st century. There is a lot more that this arcade has seen, and it probably will continue to see more. While Cleveland is not in a terrible place, it does still need a lot of work. Now, Cleveland Arcade would have temporarily closed before being refurbished and reopened in 1980, managing to thrive in the suburban shopping mall era, and the arcade did undergo a redevelopment plan in 2001, when the Hyatt Corporation obtained the arcade and overhauled it into the Regency Hotel. While most of the arcade is now a collection of hotel space, the two ground floors, and yes, there are two, they are open for public use between a small food court and local retail. There is a real possibility that if this plan didn't happen, the Cleveland Arcade would have become a private institution, or worse, ceased to exist entirely. And while I would love a view from higher up, I am at least grateful that this building still exists. It is well worth visiting if you have a day to kill walking around downtown Cleveland. This is the kind of stuff I live for, and they don't make them like they used to anymore. Imagine growing up in an era when even the lampposts and the railings they're attached to are beautiful. I bet some of you couldn't. Even I struggle with imagining that. But man, when I see it with my own eyes, I know I would much prefer this over, say, the Great Northern Mall southwest of here, or the Summit Mall in Akron, or even the Beechwood Place, which I will admit looks a lot better than most of the malls out there. And we will talk about those in another video, someday. But for now, just sit back and take in this place. Or better yet, find an opportunity to visit in person. Cleveland's not that bad if you know which places to stay out of. Okay, the food court looks a little weak. It looks like they stole this out of a 90s mall. And one of those 90s malls that had a very lazy renovation. You know what I'm talking about. I suppose I'd have to book a room here at the hotel in order to get a view from higher up, but still, just seeing this place at all from the ground up is a treat for me. We don't have much like this back home in Winston-Salem, and while our next stop doesn't quite match up to this place, it is a nice space to look at and be in as well. So with that, I better get walking. I'll see you at the next stop. And here we are at the 5th Street Arcades, and in my research, well, brief research, I've found that this place actually used to be 2 separate arcade buildings. I'll explain more as we tour. The Colonial Arcade and the Euclid Arcade. The former was built in 1898, while the latter was built in 1911, both bringing shopping and dining between the streets of Prospect Avenue and Euclid Avenue. Both arcades were not only next to each other, but were just across the street from the aforementioned Cleveland Arcade. But as one of the major manufacturing giants of the nation at the time, Cleveland could support these arcades and then some. After all, we aren't very far from the still active Playhouse Square. Now, if I were to go in depth about these 2 arcades' lives, we'd be here for about an hour. And I know you guys can barely put up with me for 10 minutes. So, what I do have is the redevelopment plan that kept these places on the map. Somewhat. It's not perfect, but the 2000s conversion does ensure that these 2 arcades would live on spiritually, with the attached historic Colonial Hotel reopening as the Residence Inn, and during this, the 2 arcade corridors would be joined together to form the 5th Street Arcades. While it's not quite what it might have been a long time ago, the first floor of both arcades still retains free access and a number of local shops and eateries. I even remember having a couple slices at Vinceza's, which has since been replaced by another pizzeria called Geraci's. I think I pronounced that right. Bear with me. Okay, tell me these aren't some pretty spaces to be in. Once again, the second floor on one half seems to be inaccessible to the public, while the other half doesn't appear to have a second floor at all, but still, I'll gladly take a view from the ground up. Not bad at all, Cleveland. Now, Cleveland is not the best city out there. You do not have to spell that out for me. And although it has come out of its darkest years, it is still a shadow of its former self. And in fact, parts of Cleveland are still pretty bad and should be avoided. But you know what? As much as I love talking about how bad some of these places can be, I wound up having fun walking around downtown and looking at old buildings like these. Hell, Cleveland probably has come out as my personal favorite, quote, mistake on the lake, end quote, out of all that have that title. Yes, Cleveland still has its problems, and some would still call the city bad, and there's one YouTube channel I watch called Urbex Hill, and he'll tell you straight away. At night, all you'll hear in some parts are police sirens and gunfire. But for me, Cleveland is a fun bad, and I would not mind putting up with it if I had to live here. After all, it's still not Detroit, and I already live in Winston-Salem, so how much worse could it be? Now, there are a couple more things I would like to talk to pertaining to sorta behind the scenes. After all, these 2 or 3 arcades are not the only thing I recorded while strolling around Cleveland. I do have footage of the Erie View Galleria, or at least what's left of it. I think only the first floor is open nowadays. And I do have a niche space referred to as the Asia Plaza on the east side. I even came in and out of the Tower City Center, one of Cleveland's 2 buildings near the square. Now, first thing I should get out of the way, and I probably should have said this at the beginning, this is all just 2021 footage, which I feel like I have to clarify a lot more than I thought I would. And the only thing I would consider redoing is the Tower City Center, since that looks quite different today. And the time I caught it, it was under heavy renovation. Now, that said, if you can talk me into going back to Cleveland, I might actually redo that. I do have one more mall on the outer east end of the region that I skipped over earlier this year, and I wouldn't mind a bit more sightseeing in Cleveland. I just need an excuse. Until we have more fun times down in Cleveland, this is Doomie Grunt wishing you and the arcades of Cleveland farewell and good luck in the future. Whenever someone asks me about football, I always say the same thing. Wake me when the Browns go to the Super Bowl.